All right, so here we are, validity. We're always back to validity, aren't we? Validity would be being able to maximize those hits and maximize those correct rejections while minimizing misses and false alarms. Base rate is the percentage of current employees who are in fact successful on the job. So if you have, let's say, 100 employees, let's make it easy math. We have 100 employees, and let's say 95 of them are what we would consider successful on the job. That's a pretty good base rate of success on the job. If, on the other hand, we had 100 employees and like 50 of them are successful on the job and the other 50 are just sort of hanging on and you wish you could replace them, but you can't find better, candidates, or they haven't quit and you don't have grounds for firing them, they're just sort of hanging on. You would say, that's not a very good base rate for, the percentage of current employees who are successful on the job. So if you have a job with lower base rate success, you're going to have a harder time predicting success because we don't really know. Obviously, what we've been doing is not doing a very good job of predicting successful employees. So when you have a lower base rate of success, if we then administer a battery of tests and we go from 50% base rate success on the job to, let's say, 60%, well, that's a pretty distinct improvement, but we still have terrible rate of success on the job, right? We still have a lot of people who are not doing well on the job. And so we might point to the battery and say that it's not very useful, when in fact it might be that it's just, this is a hard job to find people who are good at it. Selection ratio is the number of job openings divided by the number of applicants. And so if you have one job opening and 15 applicants, you have a better selection ratio. You have more people, you have a better chance of A, finding somebody who is going to be good at the job, and B, having enough people to administer the battery to that you can actually distinguish among them and let the battery show you who to hire. If you have one job and one applicant, we've got no selection ratio. There's like, if we're desperate, we may just put that body in that job and it has nothing to do with how they scored on the battery. There's no chance for there to be variability, right? And that's a frustrating circumstance to be in. We see that a lot in faculty hirings, that we don't get enough applicants at all. And so we end up with what we call failed searches, where we're like, we can't hire anybody. None of the applicants are meeting the criteria, so we have to search again next year. You need a high enough selection ratio in order for us to establish the utility of the battery. Otherwise, we might blame it on the battery, and it's not the battery's fault. We didn't have enough people to choose from. So the smaller the ratio, the greater the potential utility of the selection battery. So when we say smaller ratio, that means like 1 to 15. That's a smaller ratio. There's only 1 to every 15. Higher ratio, 1 to 3, we may not have enough variability to have this battery tell us which of these 3 people to hire. And it might not seem worthwhile to use a battery when you only have 3 applicants. Maybe you just go with your gut, or just go with, the one that seems like they've got the closest experience or some other thing. Why apply a battery? So this emphasis on selection ratio really emphasizes the importance of recruitment, the important job of putting the effort in to get the word out that there's a job available. I know that it's really hard to find a job. And part of that is because how are you supposed to know who's hiring? We tend to apply to the organizations that either we know of or that we've seen some kind of notification that they're hiring. We don't tend to just wander into places and ask, are you hiring? Like, who does that? And so organizations who have jobs are bemoaning the job market right now and saying there are no applicants for our jobs. And when you ask them, well, what are you doing to get the word out? They say, oh, we put an ad on Indeed. And, a lot of applicants are wary of ads on Indeed that have been there more than a few weeks because they figure, oh, it's probably old. They're not really hiring anymore, things like that. And I mean, you've got to make a better effort to make sure that you've got enough applicants so that you can actually make a judgment about your hiring techniques, right? Whether the battery's working or not. So let's talk about something that's really important to most organizations. It doesn't matter if you're, a corporation or you are a governmental agency or you are a charity. Like, cost is important, right? So how do we figure out the cost of, developing and implementing a hiring battery? Well, I might have this. Yeah, no, okay. So I'm not sure if my little ratio picture is the greatest picture I've ever made in my life, but that's okay. So we want to minimize the cost in actual money, right? So we want to have better employees being hired. So I feel like this arrow should be going upward, where maybe our revenue goes up because we have hired better employees. We're getting maybe more specific work or more consistent work or better creativity or whatever it is that we're looking for. We're getting that from our employees because we're hiring better employees, and that's actually boosting our revenue. And then we want to, yeah, see, I think I have my arrows backwards. We want to reduce the costs of developing and implementing the battery. We want to minimize that part. We want to be able to use a battery that already exists if we can, something like that, to minimize the cost of the battery while boosting the revenue that comes from hiring better employees. If in fact we don't get better revenue and it costs too much to do it, a lot of times the organization will come to the conclusion it's not worth it to tailor a selection battery to our organization. It's not doing for us what we want. And so if we don't find better revenue and it does cost too much, we're going to say, forget it. I'm just going to go with what we've been doing, which obviously isn't working great, but we're going to do it anyway. When revenues and costs kind of balance each other out, that's when organizations will determine that this battery is worth their while and they're more likely to invest in it. So that's something important for IO psychologists, by the way, to keep in mind, is that that there's a bottom line attached to any organization. And a lot of times when people are working for certain kinds of organizations, they don't really think about the cost to that organization. And they don't think long run, like over time, what this employee is going to do for or against the organization. And the organization is thinking those thoughts. And so they want to hire someone to maximize the benefits, or else never mind, we'll just do what we've been doing. So we're going to shift over to chapter 3 real quick and talk about some of the legal issues in employee selection. And I think I can see why the textbook puts this chapter first, because maybe you need to be aware of the law before you start implementing batteries and things like that. I feel like we kind of need to know the process of selection before we start going, okay, now, but here are some of our limitations and things to keep in mind. So a little history of legal issues in industrial psychology. Before the 1960s, there really were no laws about employment discrimination. Everybody was basically at the mercy of whoever was hiring, and they could make their decision based on anything they wanted to. And they also could fire on any grounds that they wanted to. They didn't have to account for anything. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and it was designed to provide equity or equality. Not equity, it was designed to provide equality. So everybody was supposed to be treated the same by employers. In 1978, the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, published the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. So it took 14 years after the legislation was passed before they came out with like guidelines that were uniform and intended to be applied in all sectors. 1987, SIOP published Principles for the Validation and Use of Personnel Selection Procedures, which was a big help for IO psychologists to be able to develop objective selection procedures that are validated and useful so that organizations could make good decisions that were based on data rather than gut feelings. 2003, SIOP revised those principles, and so it's been updated recently, at least in this century, I can say. Now when I talk about there were no discrimination laws prior to 1960, we were talking about like employment at will. And a lot of states still maintain basically an employment at will definition for all employees in the state have to be employment at will employees. What that means is that employers and employees have the right to initiate a working relationship, to terminate that employment relationship at any time for any reason or for no reason at all. You can just quit because you feel like it. A lot of people think, I can't quit, I have to give them 2 weeks notice. You don't have to give anybody 2 weeks notice when you're an at-will employee. And most jobs in most states are still at will, where you can quit for any reason. You don't have to give them 2 weeks notice. If you don't give them 2 weeks notice and then later ask them for a letter of recommendation, they might be like, I have some things to say about the abrupt way you left. But you're not required to work out some imaginary contract. And in the same vein, they are not required to give you 2 weeks notice that you're going to be laid off. They're not required to do any of those things either. Most jobs are at will. So some people have filed wrongful discharge claims and have been successful in that. They were fired, told that they were just being fired for no reason at all, but there might have been some discrimination at the heart of why they were dismissed. And so there's sort of implicit in this at will verbiage that you can fire them for no reason at all. You can fire them for any reason as long as it's not a discriminatory reason. Now, since the Civil Rights Act was passed, you can fire a person anytime for any non-discriminatory reason or for no reason at all. And so what a lot of employers who are firing for discriminatory reasons will say is no reason at all. We're letting you go. Why? What did I do? Nothing. We're just letting you go. And they just don't explain that because I'm discriminating against you is why. Like, they don't say that. And so it's really hard to prove that in their heart it was discriminatory, that it was wrongful discharge. It's very hard to do that. Now, there are some exceptions. Some employees work under contracts. Like, I have a contract that lasts 3 years at a time. Some of my colleagues have 1-year contracts. Some have quarterly contracts. And so you can't, like, I can't just quit in the middle of the quarter without some kind of repercussion. I don't know what that repercussion would be. And technically, you can't be fired in the middle of the quarter unless there's a really dramatic reason why you're being fired in the middle of the quarter. And there have been cases of quarterly faculty who have been fired in the middle of the quarter for very egregious violations of normal decency behaviors, like obvious violations of just things that you don't do at work. And so contracts can be terminated if one or the other parties violate the contract, right? If, for example, my employer decided to stop paying me, I'm not required to finish out the quarter, right? I'm allowed to quit as soon as I've missed 2 checks. Okay, I'm starting to get the impression I'm not being paid. I'm not going to continue working. You're not required to fill out your side of the contract if the other side of the contract is not doing their part. That's what a contract is. I will pay you for 3 months if you teach this class, and then I'm supposed to teach the class and you're supposed to pay me. That's the premise. So in any employment contract, there's always that 2 sides. And if you violate that side, and sometimes the employment contract will be really specific about anything that you can or can't do that could cause termination. And a lot of times that favors the employer because they're the ones who write up the contract. But any kind of ambiguity is always going to favor the person who didn't write the contract. And so there's sort of pros and cons on both sides. So what I'm describing is what we call just cause discharge policies, where if you do certain kinds of things, that will give us just cause to terminate you even though you have a contract. So contracts are not forever and always. You can have them broken. All right, we're going to get into some specific issues having to do with discrimination law in the next video.